Have you ever heard of cars with push-button transmissions or dashboards made entirely of steel?
It's been said that harness of this kind would save some 700 lives.
Automotive history is filled with features that once seemed innovative but turned out to be dangerous. Spanning decades from the 1940s to the 1980s, these inventions once seemed like futuristic ideas but turned out to be safety nightmares.
This is the water balloon bumpers, the safest bumper.
Today, we're exploring 20 outdated car features that were not only risky but also completely abandoned over time. Number 20. Propeller-driven cars. Propeller-driven cars, popular in the 1940s and 50s, were an experimental effort to combine aviation technology with automobiles. The Aerocar was an example, using a large propeller for movement instead of traditional mechanisms. These vehicles were created to simplify mechanics by removing the need for standard components like a drivetrain and gearbox. However, the exposed spinning blades were highly dangerous, often causing severe injuries to both pedestrians and animals. Public opinion about these cars varied significantly. Some people admired the futuristic concept and the potential for flying cars, while others were deeply concerned about the safety risks. Controlling these vehicles was challenging, particularly in strong winds, and their design proved impractical for daily use. By the late 1950s, manufacturers stopped producing propeller-driven cars because their safety hazards and impractical features outweighed their innovative appeal. Number 19. Water balloon bumpers. Water balloon bumpers, also called water-filled bumpers, were an experimental safety feature introduced in the 1960s. Invented by John Rich, these bumpers were designed to absorb the force of impacts using chambers filled with water and made of vinyl chloride. Major car manufacturers such as Ford and Chrysler tested the technology on various models, including the Ford Mustang. The idea was that the water would absorb collision energy, minimizing vehicle damage and protecting passengers. In low-speed impacts, the bumpers worked effectively, lowering repair costs and reducing injuries. However, during real-world crashes, the bumpers often burst, causing leaks and failing to provide sufficient protection. While some people were intrigued by the innovative design, others doubted its practicality. They were used in taxis and police cars in cities like New York and San Francisco, but were discontinued by the 1970s due to freezing water in winter and high maintenance costs. Number 18. Unsafe fuel tanks. In the 1970s, unsafe fuel tanks became a major problem, with the Ford Pinto being the most well-known example. Introduced in 1971, the Pinto had its fuel tank located behind the rear axle, making it prone to rupturing during rear-end collisions. This flaw resulted in severe fires that caused many injuries and deaths. Public awareness of the Pinto's dangerous fuel tank grew after investigative reports and lawsuits exposed the issue. A key case was Grimshaw versus the Ford Motor Company, in which a jury awarded $125 million in punitive damages to a victim of a Pinto fire. The public was furious when they discovered that Ford had conducted a cost-benefit analysis and determined that paying for possible lawsuits was cheaper than fixing the design. Due to rising pressure and negative media coverage, Ford recalled 1.5 million Pintos in 1978 to fix the fuel tank problem. The scandal led to significant changes in vehicle safety standards and more scrutiny of car designs. Number 17. Absence of crumple zones. In the early days of car design, vehicles had rigid frames that didn't absorb impact well. This meant that when a collision occurred, the force of the crash was directly passed on to the people inside, increasing the risk of serious injuries. Mercedes-Benz engineer Bela Bareni introduced the idea of crumple zones in 1937. He suggested that cars should have specific areas that would deform at a crash, absorbing the energy and protecting passengers. The first car to include these zones was the 1953 Mercedes-Benz Ponton model. These crumple zones were designed to absorb and spread out the energy from a collision, which reduced the impact on the occupants. Initially, people were unsure about how effective crumple zones would be. However, crash tests and real-world data soon showed how much they helped in reducing injuries. Vehicles without crumple zones were much more dangerous in accidents, as they didn't have a way to absorb crash energy. Number 16. Waist seat belts. Waist seat belts, also called lap belts, were first introduced in cars during the 1930s. These early seat belts were created to prevent passengers from being thrown out of their seats during a crash. Car manufacturers such as Nash Motors and Ford began offering lap belts as an option in the 1940s and 50s. However, these belts only held the lower body in place, leaving the upper body and head at risk of injury during an accident. Public opinion about lap belts was divided. While some people saw them as as an extra safety measure, many were skeptical and found them uncomfortable. It was not until the 1950s and 60s that the medical community started pushing for improved seatbelt designs. Dr. C. Hunter Sheldon, a neurologist, emphasized the importance of better seatbelts to reduce head and upper body injuries. The invention of the three-point seatbelt by Volvo engineer Niels Bohlin in 1959 was a major improvement. This design, which included both a lap and shoulder belt, provided much better protection and became the standard. Number 15. Pop-out windshields. Pop-out windshields were an innovative but dangerous feature introduced in the late 1940s. The first appearance of this concept was in the 1948 Tucker 48, designed by Preston Tucker. These windshields were meant to pop out as a single piece during a crash, preventing the glass from shattering and injuring passengers. The idea was that the windshield would serve as an escape hatch, helping people get out of the vehicle safely after an accident. However, public reactions were mixed. Some people appreciated the safety aspect, while others worried about the potential risks. In severe crashes, the windshield might come off too quickly, possibly throwing passengers out of the car. This major safety concern, along with the development of safer curved windshields, led to the discontinuation of pop-out windshields by the 1950s. As safety standards advanced, manufacturers shifted to laminated and tempered glass for better protection. Number 14. Drum brakes. Drum brakes were introduced in the early 1900s, with Louis Renault patenting the design in 1902. They became the standard for most vehicles from the 1940s to the 1960s. Drum brakes work by pressing brake shoes against the inside of a drum attached to the wheel, creating friction to slow the vehicle. While they were effective for their time, drum brakes had significant issues. A major problem was their tendency to overheat during heavy use, such as long downhill driving or repeated hard braking. This overheating could cause brake fade, where the brakes became less effective, increasing stopping distances and the risk of accidents. Drum brakes were also less efficient at stopping vehicles quickly compared to disc brakes, which started to appear in the 1960s. By the 1970s, most new cars had disc brakes, marking the end of the drum brake era. Number 13. Poor door latches. Poor door latches were a major safety concern in cars from the 1940s to the 1960s. These latches were often faulty, either opening during crashes or jamming shut, trapping people inside the vehicle. This flaw created a serious risk, as doors that open in a collision could cause passengers to be thrown out of the vehicle, while doors that jam could prevent escape in emergencies. Car manufacturers like Ford and General Motors used these basic latches in their vehicles. Initially, people didn't realize the dangers, but as more accidents occurred, the risks became clear. Reports of injuries and deaths from faulty latches raised concerns and led to calls for safer designs. To address these issues, car manufacturers developed and introduced improved latching systems in the 1970s. These new designs featured stronger locking systems and mechanisms that could withstand the forces of a collision. Number 12. Early airbag deployment. In the 1980s, early airbag deployment raised safety concerns. Airbags were introduced in the early 1980s as a supplemental restraint system to help protect people during crashes. Companies such as GM and Ford were among the first to add airbags to their vehicles. However, the first generation of airbags deployed with too much force, which led to injuries or even deaths, particularly for smaller people and children. Public opinion about airbags was divided. Many people saw them as a useful feature, but there were worries about the dangers linked to their forceful deployment. Reports of injuries and fatalities due to airbag force led to increased attention and demands for improvements. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, airbag technology improved. Manufacturers developed dual-stage airbags that deployed with less force and used sensors to adjust deployment depending on crash severity. Number 11. Neck seat belts. Neck seat belts were a safety feature tested in the 1960s to prevent whiplash by securing the neck during accidents. Ford and General Motors were among the car manufacturers that tried these belts in their vehicles. However, the design led to serious risks, as they could cause intense strain or injuries to the neck during collisions. Public reaction to neck seat belts was mixed. While some appreciated the idea of improving safety, many were worried about the discomfort and injury risks they posed. This skepticism led to a lack of popularity for the neck seat belts, and by the 1970s, new seatbelt technologies such as the three-point seatbelt introduced by Volvo made neck seat belts obsolete. The three-point seatbelt design offered better protection without the dangers that neck seat belts posed. Number 10. Non-collapsible steering columns. Non-collapsible steering columns were common in cars built between the 1940s and the 1960s. These rigid columns were very dangerous in accidents because they can impale the driver, causing severe injuries or even death. General Motors introduced the collapsible steering column in the late 1960s. This new design allowed the steering column to collapse during a collision, reducing the risk of injury to the driver. At first, people didn't pay much attention to the safety of steering columns, as car buyers were not very concerned about safety features at that time. However, as people became more aware of automobile safety, the dangers of rigid steering columns became clearer. Reports of serious injuries and deaths led to a growing demand for safer designs. By the 1970s, collapsible steering columns became standard in most cars, greatly improving driver safety. Number 9. Swing-away steering wheel. The swing-away steering wheel was a unique feature introduced by Ford in the early 1960s. First available on the 1961 Ford Thunderbird, it could pivot to the side, allowing drivers to enter and exit the car more easily. When the transmission was in park, the entire steering column would move about 45.72 centimeters toward the center of the vehicle. This design aimed to improve comfort and convenience, and it became popular among buyers. However, the swing-away steering wheel had a serious safety issue. There were cases where the mechanism could accidentally shift while driving, which could cause the driver to lose control of the vehicle. This concern led to growing doubts about the feature. By the late 1960s, newer steering wheel designs like tilt and telescoping steering wheels replaced the swing-away steering wheel. These designs offered similar benefits without the risks. Number 8. The wrist twist swivel system. The wrist twist swivel system was an experimental steering mechanism introduced by Ford in 1965. This innovative system replaced the conventional steering wheel with two small rotating dials, each designed for one hand. The goal was to offer a more ergonomic and space-saving way to steer the car, especially for female drivers. The system was first featured in the Mercury Park Lane. However, the wrist twist swivel system had many problems. Drivers found it difficult to use because it lacked the necessary feedback and control for safe driving. Test drivers reported that the car felt unstable and jerky, making it hard to maneuver. The public response was mixed, with many people doubting its practicality and safety. By the 1970s, it was clear that the traditional steering wheel was much safer and more effective. Ford eventually abandoned the system, recognizing that the classic steering wheel was the better option for both comfort and control. Number 7. Lack of headrests. Before the late 1960s, the absence of headrests in cars was a serious safety concern. Headrests, or head restraints, were designed to limit the backward movement of the head during a collision, helping to reduce the risk of whiplash injuries. The idea of headrests began in 1921 when Benjamin Katz patented the first design. However, they were not commonly used until much later. In the 1960s, headrests were available as optional equipment, mainly in luxury cars for extra comfort. At that time, many people did not recognize the need for headrests and considered them an unnecessary luxury. It was only after research and crash tests showed that headrests help prevent neck injuries that their importance became more evident. In 1968, Volvo became one of the first manufacturers to make headrests standard in their vehicles. By 1969, the U.S. National Highway Traffic Safety Administration required headrests in all new cars, which greatly reduced the number of whiplash injuries in rear-end collisions. Number 6. Dangerous hood ornaments. Dangerous hood ornaments were a common feature on cars from the 1940s to the 1960s. These ornaments, often made of hard and sharp materials, were intended to add elegance and represent the brand of the vehicle. Popular car companies like Cadillac, Buick, and Packard decorated their cars with these intricate designs. However, if a collision occurred, these ornaments could be extremely dangerous to pedestrians, causing serious injuries. People generally viewed hood ornaments positively, seeing them as symbols of luxury and style. But as awareness of pedestrian safety grew, the dangers of these hard ornaments became more obvious. Reports of injuries and deaths caused by hood ornaments led to increased concern and calls for safer designs. By the late 1960s, car manufacturers began to introduce collapsible or recessed hood ornaments to reduce the risk of harm. Number 5. Jet age design elements. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, car designs were heavily influenced by the excitement around aviation and space exploration. Features such as tail fins, sharp front grills, and smooth aerodynamic shapes became popular. Car makers like Cadillac, Chrysler, and Chevrolet used these designs to appeal to people's imagination and to suggest a futuristic vision. However, while these design elements were eye-catching, they created serious safety concerns. Tail fins and pointed grills could could cause severe harm to pedestrians during accidents, and over time, as people became more aware of the dangers that these features posed, there were growing calls for safer car designs. By the late 1960s, stricter safety standards and a move toward more practical aerodynamic shapes led to the decline of jet-age design elements. These changes reflected a shift in both public opinion and automotive industry priorities. Number 4. Bench seats. Bench seats were commonly found in cars from the 1940s to the 1980s. These seats, which stretched across the entire width of the car, were known for their comfort and ability to fit 3 passengers in the front. Car manufacturers like Ford, Chevrolet, and Chrysler used bench seats in many of their models, particularly in large American sedans and trucks. However, bench seats had a significant safety problem. They provided little support on the sides, making it easier for passengers to be thrown around in the event of an accident. This lack of support increased the risk of injury during collisions. As safety concerns became more important, public opinion started to change. By the 1980s, the automotive industry shifted its focus to safety and performance and bucket seats, which offered better side support, and the option for seatbelts and airbags, which became more popular. Number 3. Rigid steering wheels. Rigid steering wheels were commonly used in cars from the 1940s to the 1960s. These steering wheels were made from solid materials and did not absorb impact energy during crashes. This made them dangerous, as they could cause severe chest injuries to drivers in the event of an accident. At the time, the public accepted these steering wheels as normal because car safety wasn't a priority. However, as car speeds increased and accidents became more common, the dangers of rigid steering wheels became clear. Reports of serious injuries and deaths caused by these steering wheels led to a demand for safer designs. In response, car manufacturers developed collapsible steering columns, which absorbed impact energy and reduced injury risks. By the 1970s, collapsible steering wheels became standard in most vehicles, significantly improving driver safety. Number 2. T-top roofs. T-top roofs were a popular feature in sports cars during the 1970s and 80s. These roofs had 2 removable glass panels, offering an open-air experience similar to convertibles but with the added strength of a fixed roof structure. The idea was first introduced in the 1968 Chevrolet Corvette and later used in other cars such as the Pontiac Trans Am and the Datsun 280ZX. While T-tops were attractive and provided a unique driving experience, they had serious safety concerns. The design made the car weaker, increasing the risk of the roof collapsing during a rollover accident. Additionally, T-tops often had problems like water leaking through the panels and causing wind noise, which made them less practical for everyday use. These issues eventually led to a decline in their popularity as a feature in newer sports cars. And at number 1, asbestos brake pads. Asbestos brake pads were commonly used in the 1940s to the 1980s because they had great heat resistance and durability. Asbestos, a natural mineral, was perfect for brake pads since it could handle the high temperatures that occur during braking. Car manufacturers like Ford and General Motors included asbestos in their brake pads, making it a standard part in many vehicles. However, asbestos use caused serious health problems. When brake pads wore out, they released tiny asbestos fibers into the air. Breathing in these fibers could cause severe diseases such as lung cancer, asbestosis, and mesothelioma. Mechanics and drivers were most at risk as they were often exposed to high levels of asbestos during repairs. In the 1970s and 80s, public awareness of asbestos danger grew, leading to stricter regulations. By the late 1980s, many countries banned or restricted asbestos use in brake pads. And there you have it, 20 dangerous old car features that thankfully belong to the past. Which of these surprised you the most? Or do you know of any we missed? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more fascinating automotive content.